The morning Eleanor Marsh drove her shovel into that cracked, sun-beaten earth for the first time, every soul in Caldwell, Kansas, said she had lost her mind right along with her husband. It was the spring of 1874, and the land she had claimed sat 3 miles east of town on a stretch of flat prairie that older settlers called the Devil's Stretch. Not because anything particularly sinister had happened there, but because nothing ever grew, nothing ever stayed, and the few homesteaders who had tried before her had packed up their wagons within a single season and moved on toward more forgiving territory. The soil was pale and chalky near the surface, threaded through with clay that cracked into wide, geometric patterns during dry spells, and the nearest reliable water source was a creek that ran with more ambition than consistency, full and rushing after a rain, reduced to a stubborn trickle when the weeks ran dry. It was, by any practical measurement, the worst piece of farmable land in Sumner County, which was precisely why Eleanor had been able to claim it. She was 29 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of determined woman, with dark brown hair that she kept pinned tightly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and hands that had already begun to show the rough edges of a life that did not wait for gentleness. Her husband, Thomas Marsh, had died the previous October from a fever that moved through him fast and merciless, leaving her with a daughter named Clara, who was 7, a debt on a piece of land they had been renting closer to town, and a grief that she had no time to properly honor because the rent was still due and the world did not pause for widows. She had spent the winter doing mending work for other households and selling eggs from the 4 chickens she kept, and by February she had made a decision that her neighbor Mrs. Hattie Bloom called reckless and the Reverend at the small Baptist church called brave, which amounted to roughly the same thing when all was said and done. She filed a claim under the Homestead Act on the 80 acres of Devil's Stretch land, paid the $14 filing fee with money she had been careful not to spend on anything warmer or more comfortable, and by April she was out there with a borrowed shovel, a borrowed mule named Luther, and a plan that existed mostly in her own head and heart. "Mama, why is all the dirt white?" Clara asked on that first morning, standing at the edge of the field with her shoes already dusty, her dark braids hanging over her shoulders. "It is not white," Eleanor said, turning a clump of soil over and examining it the way Thomas had taught her to, holding it and pressing it between her fingers, feeling for the texture beneath the pale surface. "It is just thirsty. Dirt that has been thirsty for a long time looks different than dirt that has been fed." "Can we feed it?" "That is exactly what we are going to do," Eleanor said, and she drove the shovel in again. What nobody in Caldwell knew, because nobody had thought to ask, was that Eleanor had grown up on a farm in Ohio. Her father had been a patient man with difficult soil, and he had spent years working compost into ground that had been stripped by previous generations of careless farming. He had taught her that bad land was rarely hopeless land. It was just land that had been treated badly and needed someone willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of bringing it back. She had watched him do it. She had helped him do it. She understood that the clay beneath the pale surface was actually holding moisture if you could get down far enough, and she had already identified a low-lying section of the field where water pooled after rain, which told her the ground was not as uniformly impossible as its reputation suggested. She brought in straw from the livery stable in town, hauling it in her small wagon 2 loads at a time. She gathered manure from the stock pens at the edge of Caldwell, which the men there were happy to let her take away, because it saved them the trouble of moving it. She worked it into the soil by hand and by mule-drawn plow, turning it in, layering it, letting it begin the long process of becoming something useful. She planted sorghum first, because sorghum was forgiving and drought-resistant, and she had read in the agricultural pamphlet from the Kansas State Agricultural College that it was one of the best crops for difficult soil. She planted it in rows that she measured carefully with a length of rope, spacing them properly, working from before sunrise until the light failed her in the evening, with Clara beside her when school let out, placing seeds into the ground with small, serious hands. The town watched with the particular kind of polite skepticism that frontier communities had perfected. People were not unkind mostly, but they were practical. And practicality in 1874 Kansas meant that you did not invest hope in things that history had already argued against. Hattie Bloom brought Eleanor a jar of preserved peaches one afternoon, which was a kind gesture wrapped in the unmistakable flavor of pity. The hardware store owner, a man named Gerald Potts, extended her credit on a new hoe with an expression that suggested he did not expect to be repaid. The banker, Mr. Aldous Crane, had made no secret of his belief that the land would prove unworkable and that Eleanor would eventually be forced to sell at a loss, at which point he had a buyer in mind who wanted the acreage for grazing, not farming. But the sorghum came up. It came up thin at first, tentative, as if it could not quite believe the terms of the arrangement. Eleanor stood at the edge of the field on a morning in late May, and watched the thin green lines appear against the pale soil, and she put her hand over her mouth and stood very still for a long moment, and then she turned around so Clara would not see her cry. It was 3 weeks after the sorghum first showed itself that the man rode into her story. His name was Eli Calloway, and he came into Caldwell from the south on a Tuesday morning in June, which meant he had come up from Texas the long way, along the Kishom Trail with a cattle drive that had ended at the rail yards on the edge of town. He was 33 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had grown longer than he usually kept it, and a jaw covered in several days of trail dust and beard. He had been working cattle drives for 8 years, following the same seasonal rhythm that most trail hands did: winter near San Antonio doing ranch work, spring and summer pushing herds north, fall drifting back south or picking up whatever work presented itself. It was a life that was comfortable in its motion and quietly lonely in the spaces between. He had been in Caldwell before. It was one of the terminal towns along the Kishom Trail, and he knew the saloons and the boarding houses and the layout of the main street, the way a man knows a town he passes through regularly without ever quite belonging to. He was paid out his trail wages by the drive boss on Tuesday afternoon, cleaned himself up at the bathhouse, ate a proper meal at the hotel dining room, and was sitting on the porch of Dawson's General Store the following morning, intending to resupply for the ride back south, when he saw Eleanor Marsh driving her wagon down the main street of Caldwell. She was loading bags of feed into the wagon bed herself, not waiting for anyone to help her, her hat pushed back on her head and her expression focused and practical. One of the feed bags split along its seam as she lifted it, spilling grain across the wagon bed and the street, and he watched her close her eyes for just a moment, a fraction of a second of visible frustration before she straightened up, looked at the mess, and started collecting what she could save with her bare hands. He was off the porch and across the street before he had made any conscious decision to move. "Let me hold the bag," he said, crouching down beside her, gathering grain with his hat. "You can scoop it back in." She looked at him with the particular wariness that a woman alone learns to apply to unfamiliar men, measuring him quickly and with clear eyes. Whatever she saw must have been acceptable because she nodded and handed him the torn bag, and he held it from the bottom while she cupped grain back into it with her hands. "It will not hold," he said after a moment. "The seam is gone all the way across." "I know," she said. "I will put it inside a good bag when I get home." "You have another bag. I will make do," she said, in a tone that indicated she had considerable experience in that particular art. He helped her transfer the grain into a different bag he found in the wagon bed, and when it was done they both stood up and she brushed the chaff from her hands and said, "Thank you, that was kind." "Eli Calloway," he said, because it seemed like the natural next thing. "Eleanor Marsh," she said. "I would offer to shake hands, but mine are not particularly clean at the moment." "Neither are mine," he said, and she almost smiled. He did not intend to talk to her again after that. He resupplied from Dawson's, bought himself a new pair of gloves, and was planning to start south within a day or two. But that evening at the hotel, he found himself at a table near Gerald Potts, the hardware man, who had a habit of filling silences with local information. And within 20 minutes Eli had learned about the widow Marsh and her impossible land and her sorghum crop, and the general consensus of the town that she was courageous and doomed in roughly equal measure. He did not know why that settled in him the way it did. Perhaps because he had grown up watching his own mother work herself to the bone after his father had died of a heart failure when Eli was 14, and there was something in the description of Eleanor Marsh, the specific quality of a woman refusing to be defeated by circumstances that would have broken someone less stubborn, that resonated in a place he had kept fairly well sealed for a long time. Or perhaps it was simply that he had been moving for so long that the sight of someone putting roots into the ground, even difficult ground, made him feel the absence of rootedness in his own life more acutely. Whatever the reason, he rode out to the Devil's Stretch the next morning. He told himself he was just looking. The land was on the road south anyway, more or less, and it cost him nothing to see what he had heard described. Eleanor was in the field when he arrived, working between the rows of sorghum with a long-handled hoe clearing weeds that had come up with the crop. She had her back to the road, and Clara was visible at the edge of the field, seated on an upturned bucket with a book open in her lap, her dark braids moving in the prairie wind. The small homestead house was behind them, a modest structure of wood and sod, with a kitchen garden beside it where Eleanor had planted beans and squash, and a few rows of potatoes. Eli stopped his horse at the road's edge and looked at the field for a long moment. The sorghum was thin but real, growing and careful, even rows across ground that he could see by the pale surface had been seriously challenged. He could see the work in it, not just the crop itself, but the evidence of preparation, the turned soil, the careful spacing of the rows, the amendment of the ground that showed in its darker color near the plants compared to the untouched earth further from the rows. "Are you going to sit out there on the road all morning, or are you going to say something?" Eleanor called out without turning around. He laughed, surprised. "How did you know I was here?" "Luther told me," she said, nodding toward the mule in the small paddock to the side of the house, who had lifted his head and faced the road when Eli arrived. "He is a better watchdog than he looks." Eli rode up to the edge of the field. Up close, he could see that Eleanor was working efficiently but not easily. The clay soil was hard even this close to the planted rows, and the hoe was clearly heavier work than she was going to admit to anyone. "Your sorghum looks better than I expected, given what they are saying in town," he said. She stopped hoeing and turned to look at him, shading her eyes with her hand. "And what are they saying in town?" "That it would not grow," he said honestly. She looked at the rows of sorghum with an expression that was part satisfaction and part something more complicated, something that had grief in it and determination mixed so thoroughly they could not be separated. "Thomas always said that people are better at predicting failure than they are at preventing it," she said. "He was talking about other things when he said it, but it applies. Thomas is your husband." "Was," she said, and her tone was not bitter but it was clear. "He passed last October." "I am sorry," Eli said, and meant it. "Are you just riding through?" she asked, with the directness of someone who had learned that time was not something to waste on indirection. "Was planning to ride south in a day or two," he said. "Came up the trail with a cattle drive. My time is my own for the moment." She looked at him steadily with those clear, practical eyes. "You know anything about farming?" The question surprised him. "Some," he said. "Grew up on a farm in Missouri before I started working cattle, long time ago." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I need to get water from the creek to the lower section of the field. The sorghum there is slower than the upper rows because it is drier. I have a system worked out with barrels and the mule, but it takes most of a morning to do what I need, and by the time the water is out I have lost the cool part of the day for the other work." He understood what she was not quite asking. "I could help with the water," he said, "if you want an extra pair of hands." She looked at him for another long moment, considering. He could see her weighing things, the pragmatism of the offer against the wariness that was simply sensible for a woman alone on a piece of land 3 miles from town. "I am not paying wages," she said. "I cannot afford to." "I am not asking for wages," he said. "Then what are you asking for?" He thought about it honestly because she deserved an honest answer. "I have been moving for 8 years," he said. "I have been on 400 miles of trail, and I have not done anything that felt useful in a long time, just moving cattle from one place to another. I would like to do something that stays put when I am finished." Something shifted in her expression. It was not trust exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that could become trust, given time and reason. "All right," she said. "The barrels are beside the house." He was there every day for the rest of that week. He came in the mornings after breakfast at the hotel, and he worked until late afternoon, and then he rode back to town. Eleanor fed him lunch, simple food, biscuits and beans, and whatever she had that was ready from the kitchen garden, and Clara watched him with the frank, assessing gaze of a 7-year-old who had decided to form her own opinions about every adult she encountered. "Were you in any wars?" Clara asked him on the second day, while he was eating. "Clara," Eleanor said. "I am just asking," Clara said. "It is all right," Eli said. He looked at the girl. "I was in the end of the war when I was young," he said. "I was not old enough to do much except carry things and stay out of the way." Clara seemed to find this mildly disappointing. "Did you ever shoot anyone?" "Clara," Eleanor said again, more firmly. "I am trying to determine if he is trustworthy," Clara said with complete seriousness. Eli bit back a smile. "I think that is a very reasonable thing to determine," he said to Eleanor, and she looked at him over the top of her coffee cup with an expression that was the closest she had come yet to genuine amusement. "She is her father's daughter," Eleanor said quietly, and for just a moment her eyes went somewhere else before she came back. The work he did that week was not glamorous work. He hauled water. He cleared rocks from the section of field Eleanor wanted to expand her planting into. He helped her repair the fence around the kitchen garden, where a post had rotted and leaned so far it was nearly horizontal. He was not a man who minded work. 8 years of trail driving had made him comfortable with long days and physical labor, but there was a quality to this work that was different from the trail. It had direction. Each day the field was a little better, the water a little more reliably distributed, the fence a little more solid, and he could see the result of it in the land itself, which was beginning to look less like something being argued with and more like something being listened to. He learned Eleanor's rhythms during those days. She was not a woman who talked constantly, and he appreciated that because he was not a man who did either. She talked when she had something to say, and when she did not, the silence between them was comfortable and workable. She was precise about things that mattered, the spacing of her watering, the specific sections of soil she was amending, and unconcerned with things that did not, like the state of her hat or whether her dress got muddy. She was patient with Clara in a way that told him she had thought carefully about how to raise a child in difficulty without making the child carry the weight of the difficulty. At the end of the week, on a Friday evening as he was saddling his horse to ride back to town, she came out of the house with a folded cloth in her hands. "I made extra bread this morning," she said, and held it out. He took it, and their fingers brushed in the handover, and neither of them remarked on it. "I will be back tomorrow," he said, because it had become the natural thing to say, and her eyes held his for a moment before she nodded. He lay awake that night in the boarding house he had moved to from the hotel, thinking about the way the sorghum rows looked in the evening light when the sun came low and golden across the prairie, and about the way Eleanor Marsh had her back perfectly straight no matter how tired she was, and about how the worst piece of land in Sumner County was slowly, unmistakably beginning to yield. He had been planning to ride south. He did not ride south. By the third week, the understanding between them had shifted in some way that neither of them acknowledged directly. He had moved from hauling water and clearing rocks to more skilled work. He understood enough about soil drainage from his Missouri childhood to see where the clay was holding too much water in one section and choking the roots, and he spent 2 full days carefully cutting small drainage channels that redirected the excess moisture laterally along the natural slope of the land. Eleanor watched him plan it out one morning on a scrap of paper, drawing the lines of the channels with a stub of pencil, and she leaned over the paper beside him and pointed to a section he had not accounted for and said, "That corner floods when the creek is high. You would need to root it wider here," and he looked at where she was pointing and saw that she was right. "How do you know that?" he asked. "I walked the whole field in the rain last month," she said. "I wanted to see where the water went." He looked at her. "You walked your field in the rain." "It was the only way to see it properly," she said, as if this were entirely obvious. He looked back at the map and made the adjustment she had indicated, and something in the act of the two of them bent over that piece of paper, her correction improving his plan, the collaboration of it, felt significant in a way he did not quite know how to hold yet. Clara had accepted him by this point with a matter-of-fact ease that he found touching. She showed him her book, a tattered copy of a natural history of North American birds that had been her father's, and quizzed him on which birds he had seen on the trail. He had seen many of them, and he described them as best he could remember, the way the scissor-tailed flycatcher dipped and rose in the Texas wind, the sound the meadowlarks made on the Kansas morning, and Clara listened with the focused attention of someone collecting information for important future use. "My papa knew all the birds," Clara said on one of these evenings, turning the pages of the book carefully. "He could tell them by their songs." "That is a real skill," Eli said. "Mama says he is in the ground now," Clara said, with the specific philosophical acceptance of a child who has been given honest language for a hard thing. "But I think he is probably in the birds too, because he loved them so much." Eli did not say anything for a moment. The prairie wind moved through the grass, and the evening light was turning everything amber, and the small house sat there with its kitchen garden and its paddock and its stubborn, growing sorghum, and he understood suddenly, with a clarity that surprised him, that he did not want to leave this place. It was not a comfortable realization. He had built his life around motion, around the trail, around the specific freedom of a man with no fixed obligations, and he had told himself for 8 years that this was enough. He had told himself this with such consistency that he had largely stopped noticing that it was a thing he needed to tell himself, which was, he suspected, a sign that it had never quite been true. He did not say anything to Eleanor about any of this. He was not a man who spoke before he was sure of his own ground, and he was not yet sure of his ground. But the following Monday, when he rode out to the field and she was already up on the roof of the small house, attempting to replace a section of roofing that had come loose and was letting weather in above Clara's sleeping area, he looked up at her and said, "You are going to fall off that roof." "I am not going to fall off my roof," she said, in the tone of a woman who has been underestimated recently and found it tiresome. "Move over," he said, and climbed up beside her with the shingles, and they worked side by side on the roof in the morning heat, and at some point they were working closely enough that he could see the small scar above her left eyebrow that she must have gotten as a child, and the way she bit her lower lip slightly when she was concentrating on placing a shingle exactly right, and he felt the feeling he had been carefully not naming gather itself into something undeniable. "I was planning to go back to Texas in June," he said, looking at the work in front of him. "It is nearly August," she said, equally focused on her shingle. "Yes," he said, a pause. "Are you going?" she asked. He looked at her. She was looking at the roof, but there was a quality of attention in her stillness that told him she was listening completely. "I do not think so," he said. She pressed the shingle into place. "All right," she said, and her voice was careful and her hands were steady, and her cheeks were a slightly different color than they had been a moment ago, which might have been the heat and might have been something else entirely. They finished the roof and climbed down, and she made coffee, and they sat on the porch in the chairs she had brought from inside. There were only two, and Clara was at school, and the prairie stretched out before them gold and green in the summer light, and Eleanor said, "Tell me about Missouri." He told her. He told her about the farm his father had owned, the river-bottom land with the black soil that grew corn so well it seemed effortless compared to what she was doing here. He told her about his mother, who had kept the farm running after his father died, with a combination of stubbornness and mathematical cleverness, about money that had saved them when everything else might have fallen apart. He told her about the moment he had decided to go south after the war, when he was 18 and the farm felt too small for the grief it contained, and how he had ended up on his first cattle drive almost by accident, and how the motion of it had seemed, for a long time, like something close to peace. She listened without interrupting, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I think grief can turn into movement if you let it. Thomas's death could have sent me south too, or east, or anywhere. I chose to stay because Clara needed something that stayed, but also because I did not want the grief to be the thing that made my decisions." "When did you stop being afraid of this land?" he asked. She considered. "I have not stopped being afraid of it," she said. "I am afraid of it every morning. I just decided the fear was not a good enough reason to stop." He looked at her in the way a man looks at a woman when he realizes that what he is feeling is not simple admiration or attraction, but something foundational, something that comes from recognizing in another person the specific quality you have been missing in yourself, or wanting to be more like. He had been brave in physical ways his whole life on the trail, in difficult weather, in the couple of genuinely dangerous situations that found you if you worked cattle long enough. But Eleanor's specific variety of courage, the daily, undramatic, persistent kind, made his own seem like a much simpler thing. He did not say any of this. He said the sorghum is going to be ready to harvest by September. "I know," she said. "I have been thinking about the market. Caldwell buys sorghum for the cattle. Mr. Potts mentioned it. He would buy it at fair price. Fairer than Crane would if he got his hands on the arrangement," she said, with a sharpness about the banker that told him there was a history there. "What does Crane want?" Eli asked. She set down her coffee cup and looked out at the field. "He has a buyer for this land," she said. "A rancher from south of here who wants to add acreage. He has been making it clear in the polite way that bankers manage that he expects me to fail and sell, and that when I do, he will be ready to facilitate the transaction." "But you are not going to fail," Eli said. She turned and looked at him, and for the first time in all the weeks he had been coming to this land, she smiled at him fully, without the careful management she usually applied to her expressions, and it was the kind of smile that reorganized things. "No," she said, "I am not." The summer deepened and the work continued and the sorghum grew, and somewhere in those long days of shared labor something between Eleanor and Eli was growing just as surely, if more slowly, because Eleanor Marsh was a woman who had been leveled once by love's ending and was not going to move into new territory without being entirely sure of the ground. He understood this. He waited and he worked, and he let the days do what days do when they are full of honest company. There was an evening in late July when a storm came up fast from the southwest, the way Kansas storms did, without sufficient warning and with serious intention. Eli had been working in the far section of the field when the sky went green-gray, and the wind came in a sudden hot gust that bent the sorghum sideways. Eleanor came running out of the house. "The stakes on the western rows," she said. "The wind will take them." They ran to the field together, driving the stakes deeper with a mallet as the first drops fell, fat and hard as pebbles, and the lightning was doing its mathematical counting across the sky. They worked fast and without talking much because there was not time for talking, moving down the rows, and the rain came properly then, soaking them both in about 30 seconds flat. Clara appeared at the door of the house, and Eleanor shouted for her to stay inside and stay away from the windows, and Clara retreated. They got the last stake driven just as the real force of the storm arrived, and they ran for the shelter of the porch together and stood there, breathing hard, dripping, watching the rain hammer the field. The sorghum was bending dramatically but holding, and in the lightning flashes the field looked almost mythological. This small, impossible piece of cultivated earth holding its own against a Kansas sky that seemed determined to test it. Eleanor was laughing. It startled him because she was not a woman who laughed easily or often, and the sound was so genuine and so free of the careful management she usually maintained that he turned to look at her. "What?" he said. "I do not know," she said, still laughing, rain dripping from her hat brim, her dress soaked through, the storm roaring around the porch. "I think I am just glad it is still there." He looked at the field and then back at her, and the laugh was infectious, and he was laughing too, and they stood there laughing in the storm like two people who had come unstuck from the serious weight of things for a moment. And when the laughter subsided, they were standing close together on the small porch and the rain was still falling, and she was looking at him with those clear, direct eyes, and what was in them now was unmistakable. He did not rush it. He said, "I should check on Luther," because the mule was his concern, and it gave them both a moment to breathe. And she nodded, and he went out into the rain and found Luther unhappy but sheltered under the lean-to roof of the paddock. And when he came back, she had gone inside to change. And when she came back to the porch, she brought him a dry shirt that had been Thomas's. "It should fit you well enough," she said, and then went back inside, and he changed on the porch with the rain still going and stood in Thomas Marsh's shirt and thought about the generosity of that gesture, which was not a small thing. The storm passed. The sorghum survived. And the next morning, with the field sparkling and washed and greener than it had ever looked, Eleanor came out with coffee and handed him a cup and said, "I think the hardest thing about this land is not the soil or the water. The hardest thing is that nobody believed in it." "Some people do now," he said. She looked at the field. "Clara believes in it. You believe in it." A pause. "I believe in it more because you do." "You believed in it before I ever got here," he said. "Yes," she said. "But it is different believing alone." He set down his coffee cup. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him, and her face was completely open in the morning light, all the careful management set aside. "I would like to stay," he said. "Not just to help with the field. I would like to stay because of you, and Clara, and this piece of land that everyone said was worthless." He paused, making sure he was saying it completely. "I have been moving for a long time, and I would very much like to stop, but only if I am stopping somewhere that means something. And this means something. You mean something to me." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him, and he could see her thinking, not with doubt, but with the serious attention she gave to everything that mattered. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "I loved him completely. I want you to know that." "I know that," he said. "And I am not done missing him," she said. "That does not stop." "I would not expect it to," he said. "But," she said, and the word carried weight and warmth both, "I have been watching you on this land for 2 months, and I have been watching the way you are with Clara, and the way you listen when I talk about something that matters to me, and the way you repaired that fence post even though it was not strictly necessary because you could see it was going to give us trouble later." And I think she stopped. Took a breath. "I think that I would like you to stay too." He reached out and took her hand, the one that was rough from work and summer sun, and held it between both of his, and she looked at their joined hands and then up at him, and what passed between them in that moment was quiet and large and real. "All right then," he said. "All right," she said. Clara appeared in the doorway of the house with her bird book and looked at the two of them on the porch, assessing the situation with her characteristic directness. "Are you going to live here now?" she asked Eli. "Clara," Eleanor said. "I want to know," Clara said reasonably. Eli looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Eli. "We will figure that out properly," Eleanor said to her daughter. "Okay," Clara said, apparently satisfied, and went back inside. Eli and Eleanor stood on the porch in the clean morning after the storm, hand in hand, and the sorghum grew. In August, Aldous Crane made his move, and it was not entirely unexpected. He came out to the homestead on a Wednesday morning in the Banks buggy, dressed in his town suit, and his particular expression of professional concern, which was the face he made when he wanted to appear to be helping you while actually helping himself. Eleanor saw the buggy from the field and she came in from where she was working, and Eli, who had been at the eastern edge of the property mending the fence line, saw the buggy too and walked up. Crane got out of the buggy and took in the field, the sorghum now tall and legitimately green, the organized rows, the clear evidence that the land was, against all expectation, producing, and something moved across his face that was not quite concealed before he rearranged it into his professional concern expression. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, tipping his hat. "Good to see you looking well." "Mr. Crane," she said. He glanced at Eli with the kind of look that people gave to men they wanted to categorize. "Is this a hired hand?" "This is Eli Calloway," Eleanor said, in a tone that provided no further category information. "Ah," Crane said, apparently deciding the category was irrelevant to his purpose. He turned back to Eleanor. "Mrs. Marsh, I have come to make you a very fair offer. My buyer is still interested in this land, and given the drought conditions forecast for next year—" "There is no drought forecast that I know of," Eleanor said. "Agricultural uncertainty is always a concern," Crane said smoothly. "The clay soils in this section have a history of reverting after wet years. The drainage has been corrected," Eli said, keeping his voice level. Crane looked at him. "Has it?" "Significantly," Eli said. "The water management in the lower section in particular has been substantially improved. The yield this September is going to surprise people." Crane was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. "Be that as it may," he said, "the offer I have represents fair market value for the land as raw acreage, and I am prepared to—" "Mr. Crane," Eleanor said, and her voice was entirely pleasant and entirely immovable, "I appreciate you driving out, but I am not selling. The land is not for sale. It will not be for sale. When September comes and the crop goes to market, I intend to use the proceeds to improve the property further, and by next spring I expect to have a second field under cultivation. I am going to be here for a long time." Crane looked at her and then at the field, and she could see him doing arithmetic. "Mrs. Marsh, you should think carefully. I think carefully about everything," she said. "That is how I got sorghum to grow on land you told me was worthless when I filed the claim." He had not been in the room when she filed the claim, but the implication was clear and it landed. He straightened his hat, made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite retreat, and said, "Well, I trust you know your own business." "I do," she said. He got back in his buggy. As he turned it around, he looked at Eli with a calculating expression. "You planning to stay in the area, Mr. Calloway?" "Yes," Eli said. "I am." Crane drove back toward town, and Eli and Eleanor stood and watched the buggy shrink along the road, and then Eleanor let out a long breath and said, "He will be back." "Probably," Eli said, "but you will have a harvest between now and then." She looked at him sideways. "You said next spring we would have a second field." "I did," he said. "That assumes you are still here in the spring," she said, and her voice was careful but her eyes were direct. "I will be here in the spring," he said. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something was decided. "Then we should talk about what to plant." The harvest came in September, and it was not a spectacular harvest by the standards of good land, but it was a real harvest, and it was more than anyone in Caldwell had expected from the Devil's Stretch. Eleanor drove the wagon to town herself on the first market day, with the sorghum loaded in the back, Eli beside her on the wagon seat and Clara between them, and the people who had watched her all summer with polite skepticism came out to see. Gerald Potts bought the sorghum at fair price, as he had told her he would, and counted out the money on the counter of his store with an expression that was gratifyingly short on the earlier pity and long on honest respect. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, when the transaction was complete, "I have to say I am impressed." "The soil was not as bad as people thought," she said. "No," he said, looking out his window toward the south where the Devil's Stretch lay invisible beyond the edge of town. "Maybe it was not." Hattie Bloom was at the store that day too, and she came over and hugged Eleanor in the full, encompassing way of a woman who has been wrong and knows it and wants to make up the distance between where she was and where she should have been. I should have believed in you, Hattie said. You brought me preserved peaches when I needed them, Eleanor said. That counts for a great deal. They had enough from the harvest to pay down the filing fee debt, to buy the materials Eli needed to build a proper hay barn before winter, and to purchase the seed for the expanded planting Eleanor had been planning. It was not wealth. It was not even comfort by any easy definition. But it was solid, and it was hers, and it was earned from the ground that everyone had said would give her nothing, which made it taste like something far sweeter than the numbers indicated. That evening, after the transaction and the town and the ride home, Eleanor put Clara to bed and came back out to the porch where Eli was sitting with the remnant of the day's warmth still in the air, and the stars beginning to establish themselves over the Kansas dark. She sat down beside him, and after a moment she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that in the quiet with the field in front of them and the stars overhead and the sounds of the prairie night all around. Thomas would have liked you, she said quietly after a while. He held her a little closer. Tell me something about him, he said. She was still for a moment, and then she told him about the day Thomas had found a red-tailed hawk with a broken wing on their old rented property, and had spent 3 weeks nursing it in the barn, fashioning a splint from strips of cloth and a piece of thin wood, feeding it scraps of meat until it could fly again. And the morning it finally flew was the happiest she had ever seen him look, watching this wild thing return to its element. She told him this carefully and with love, and when she was done Eli said, "No wonder Clara believes that birds carry the people who loved them." Eleanor lifted her head and looked at him in the starlight. "Will you stay the winter?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "And the spring?" "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see that she was asking something larger than the words contained, and he met the larger question directly. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was quiet and serious and warm all at once, "I know that this land and this life and this family that you have built out of the hardest circumstances I have ever seen, I know that these are yours. I'm not asking to come in and take anything over. But I would like to be part of it if you will have me. All the way part of it, for good." She reached up and touched his face with her rough, capable, work-honest hand, and she said, "Eli Calloway, you have been making yourself part of it since you crossed the street to help me pick up spilled grain. I just wanted to make sure you knew what you were committing to. Difficult land and a 7-year-old who asks whether you have ever shot anyone and a woman who walks her fields in the rain," he said. "Yes," she said, "exactly that. I know exactly what I am committing to," he said, and he meant every word of it with the fullness of a man who had finally found the place he had been moving toward for 8 years without knowing what it looked like. He kissed her then, on the porch of the small house on the impossible land in the September dark, and she kissed him back with the straightforwardness and warmth that was entirely her own, and the prairie night was all around them, and it was, in the specific way of things that have been genuinely earned, perfect. The winter was hard the way Kansas winters were always hard, with a cold that came off the open plains without any apology and wind that found every gap in the house's construction with mechanical thoroughness. Eli and Eleanor spent November reinforcing the insulation of the house with sod bricks along the north and west walls, which was not elegant work but effective. And the hay barn was finished before the first real snow, which meant Luther and Eleanor's 2 other mules. She had purchased a second one with the harvest money, and then been given a third by a neighbor who was moving east and could not take it where properly sheltered. Clara sat with Eli in the evenings while Eleanor worked on her winter mending, which she did for several households in town to bring in additional income, and Clara read to him from her bird book, and from a school book about the geography of North America that she had decided was more interesting than her arithmetic text, and Eli listened seriously and asked questions that made her think. And Eleanor watched them from across the room with a feeling she did not name but recognized as happiness of the specific, earned kind that knows its own cost and is grateful rather than surprised. He taught Clara to play checkers in December, and she beat him with such regularity and clear delight that he began to suspect she had been playing with her father long before he arrived. And when he said so, she grinned at him with her father's grin, according to what Eleanor had told him, and said, "I am just very good at it." "You are terrifying," he said admiringly, and she beamed. He slept in the hay barn that winter, on a pallet with blankets, which was cold but manageable and appropriate to the reality of their situation. They were not married yet, and there was a child in the house, and Eleanor cared about what was right, not in the rigid, fearful way of people who care about appearances, but in the genuine way of a woman who had a clear sense of her own values. He did not suggest anything different. He had told her he would be there in the spring, and he was there in the winter, which was a larger statement than the spring one, because the winter was when you found out who was genuinely committed and who had simply meant to be. He found that he loved the winter on the homestead in a way that surprised him. The trail winters had been about endurance, finding shelter, keeping warm, waiting for the season to turn so the work could begin again. This winter was about something else. It was about the way the light came through the frosted window in the morning and fell across the kitchen table where Eleanor sat with her coffee before Clara woke. It was about the way the snow on the field transformed the sorghum stubble into something sculptural and austere and quietly beautiful. It was about the particular quality of warmth inside a house that two people have made habitable together, the accumulated small decisions of a shared life. He spent part of those winter months doing work for other homesteaders in the area, lending his hands to things that needed doing, building a reputation in the county as a reliable man and a skilled one, which was useful in ways both practical and social. The people who had known him only as the trail hand who had stopped to help the widow on the Devil's Stretch began to know him as something else, a man who was putting down roots, a man who was becoming part of the fabric of the place. In January, he wrote a letter to his mother in Missouri. He had not written regularly in years. The trail life did not encourage correspondence. But he sat at Eleanor's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and wrote a letter that was the longest he had written in a decade, telling her about Kansas and the homestead and the sorghum and Eleanor Marsh, and Clara and her bird book and her capacity to beat grown men at checkers without remorse. He told his mother that he had stopped moving. He told her he was, for the first time in 8 years, where he was supposed to be. His mother's letter came back in 3 weeks, which was relatively fast for the winter mail, and it was characteristically direct. She was glad he had stopped moving because she had been concerned about it for some years. She hoped this Eleanor woman was as intelligent as he made her sound because he needed someone intelligent, and she wanted a photograph when one became possible. He showed Eleanor the letter and she read it and laughed. "I like her," she said. "You would get along extremely well," he said. "It would be terrifying for everyone else in the room." February brought a stretch of weather so cold that even with the insulated walls the house was difficult to heat through to the bedrooms, and Eleanor moved Clara into the main room to sleep near the stove, and on one particularly bitter night she came out to the barn with extra blankets and a lamp and found him awake reading, or trying to, in the cold. "Come inside," she said. "You can sleep in the kitchen near the stove. This is not reasonable." "I am fine," he said. "Eli Calloway," she said, in the tone she used when something was decided, "you are sleeping near the stove." He slept near the stove, on a pallet she made up for him, and Clara slept on her cot nearby, and Eleanor went back to her room, and in the morning Clara woke up first and said to him with great matter-of-factness, "When are you and Mama going to get married?" "Clara," Eleanor said from the doorway, having apparently been awake long enough to hear the question. "It makes more sense," Clara said. "Then you would not have to sleep in the barn." "Clara, go wash your face," Eleanor said. Clara went to wash her face with the specific gait of a person who has made their point and is content to let it stand. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway in the morning light, and Eli got up from the pallet and looked at her, and they were both thinking the same thing that Clara had just said aloud, and after a moment Eleanor said, "She is not wrong." "No," he said, "she is not." "Is that," she stopped, began again. "Is that something you want?" He walked across the kitchen to her, and she did not step back or look away, and he said, "Eleanor Ruth Marsh, I would like very much to marry you. Not because of the cold in the barn and not because of anything practical, because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met and because I love you. Entirely." Her eyes were bright. She put her hand flat against his chest, and he put his hand over hers, and she said, "I love you too. I have been loving you since about the middle of July, and it has been very inconvenient." "Has it?" he said, and he was smiling. "I had crops to think about," she said, and he laughed and she laughed, and from the back of the house Clara called, "Are you getting married?" And Eleanor said, "Yes, Clara, we are getting married." And from the back of the house came a satisfied "good," and the sound of water being poured. They were married on a Saturday in March, at the small Baptist church in Caldwell, with a congregation that was notably larger than either of them had expected. Word had gotten around that the widow who had grown sorghum on the Devil's Stretch was marrying the cowboy who had helped her do it. And there was something about this story that the town of Caldwell found satisfying in a way that went beyond the usual wedding sentiment. It was a story about something working out that everyone had expected not to, and those stories had a particular value on the frontier, where the counterexamples to working out were numerous and heavy. Hattie Bloom cried with genuine happiness. Gerald Potts shook Eli's hand and told him he was a fortunate man, which Eli already knew. Aldous Crane was not at the wedding, which said what it needed to say. Clara walked with her mother down the short aisle of the church and then took her seat in the front pew with the solemn dignity of someone who had strongly recommended this outcome and was glad to see it coming to fruition. She had worn her good dress, and Eli had gotten her a small bunch of early spring wildflowers, which she held with absolute seriousness throughout the ceremony. The Reverend was a man named Josiah Cross, who had been at the frontier long enough to understand that the love between people who had both survived difficult things had a specific texture and depth that deserved ceremony equal to its reality, and he gave them that ceremony. When he said, "Through all that may come," and looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor looked at Eli, there was a fullness of understanding in both their faces that made the words mean something beyond their usual weight. "I do," Eleanor said, with the directness of a woman who says what she means. "I do," Eli said, with the quietness of a man who has never meant anything more. He kissed her in the church with the congregation watching and Clara making a small, satisfied sound from the front pew, and then they walked out into the March sunlight, husband and wife, and the prairie was beginning to show its first green of the new season. He moved his things from the barn into the house that afternoon, and Clara supervised the arrangement of his belongings with the authority of someone who had decided opinions about where things should go. And Eleanor cooked a proper dinner with a chicken she had been saving, and a pie made from the last of the dried apples from the fall. And they sat at the kitchen table together, the three of them, and ate and talked and laughed. And it was the easiest evening Eli had spent in as long as he could remember. Because is the specific quality of a life that fits. Spring came with the usual Kansas energy, fast and dramatic, the kind of spring that did not apologize for winter, but simply arrived on top of it and insisted. They planted the second field in April. Eli had spent the winter months preparing it, turning the soil in sections when the weather permitted, working in the composted material they had been accumulating. And by planting time, the second field was substantially better prepared than the first had been a year earlier. This time they planted both sorghum and winter wheat. The wheat was an experiment, because winter wheat had been showing itself adaptable to the Kansas climate, and the demand for it was growing as more families settled in the region. They also planted a larger kitchen garden, with Eleanor's original crops plus tomatoes and sweet corn that she had not attempted before, and a section of her own devising that she had been planning all winter. A small orchard of fruit trees, just 6 of them, 3 apple and 3 plum, planted along the western fence line where the soil was deepest, and the wind would not take them if they were properly staked. "They will not bear for 3 years," she said, when she and Eli planted them on a mild April afternoon, tamping the soil carefully around the base of each one. "Maybe 4. Then we had better plan to be here in 3 or 4 years," Eli said. She smiled at him over the sapling she was holding. "We had better," she agreed. The spring and summer of 1875 were different from the year before in a way that Eli found himself thinking about often. The previous year had been about survival, about proving the land was possible, about Eleanor holding on with everything she had. This year was about building, and the two of them doing it together changed the quality of everything. He was not helping her manage something nearly overwhelming. They were constructing a life from a shared foundation, deciding together what to plant and when and where, disagreeing occasionally and working it out, making decisions about the property that were mutual because they were mutual in the larger sense, bound to each other and to the land both. Clara finished the school year in May with the best marks in her class, which she reported with characteristic matter-of-factness, and which both Eleanor and Eli received with pride that probably exceeded what strict proportion required. She had been working her way through her father's bird book with systematic thoroughness, and by summer she had identified 37 different species on or near the homestead, which she had documented in a notebook with small, careful drawings that were remarkably accurate for a 7-year-old who had become, by the middle of the summer, an 8-year-old. Her birthday was in June, and Eli had been working on something for 3 weeks prior, in the evenings in the barn after Clara was in bed. He had found at the general store a small illustrated encyclopedia of North American wildlife, not just birds but also mammals and reptiles and insects, and he had written inside the front cover, in the careful hand of a man who had taught himself to write neatly because the trail required it for driving records. "For Clara, who notices everything. From Eli." He had also built her a small wooden box with a hinged lid, sized exactly right for the collection of interesting rocks, feathers, and pressed wildflowers she had been accumulating without proper storage. She opened both on her birthday morning at the kitchen table and looked at the encyclopedia for a long time in silence, turning the pages, and then she looked at Eli and said, "This is the best present I have ever gotten besides the bird book Papa got me." "That is very good company," he said. She nodded, turned the page to an illustration of a pronghorn antelope, and began to read. Eleanor caught his eye across the table, and what passed between them in that look was the full, complete, quiet happiness of people who have built something real. It was in August of 1875 that Eleanor told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on his face, watching for his reaction with the particular careful attention of a woman who has learned that what comes next is never entirely predictable. His face went through several things in quick succession: surprise, because even when you are hoping for something its arrival can be startling, and then a warmth so thorough it changed his whole expression. And then he was around the table and he had his arms around her, and she was pressed against him with her face against his chest. And he said, "Eleanor," in the voice of a man holding something extraordinary. "In the spring," she said, muffled against his shirt. "March or April, I think." "A spring baby," he said. "Like the crops," she said, and he could feel her smiling. Clara was told with appropriate ceremony that evening, and she received the information with the focused consideration she gave everything important. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" she asked. "We do not know yet," Eleanor said. Clara considered this. "I would like a brother," she said. "I have several friends at school who have brothers and it seems useful." "We cannot promise that," Eleanor said. "I understand," Clara said, in the tone of someone noting a limitation of the process. "Either way, I will teach them checkers." The fall harvest of 1875 was substantially larger than the first. The expanded field had produced, and the winter wheat was a genuine success. Eli's instinct about the adaptability of the wheat variety to the clay-amended soil had been correct, and they sold it at a price that was noticeably better than the sorghum, because demand in the region for wheat flour was growing as the population grew. Eleanor sat with the ledger at the kitchen table in October and went through the numbers with the methodical intelligence she applied to financial things, and at the end of it she looked up and said, "We are not in debt." It was the first time in Eleanor's life as an independent homesteader that those words were true, and they sat there between them with the weight of everything they represented. "No," Eli said. "We can start the third field next spring," she said. "After the baby," he said. "I will still be able to work," she said, and her tone told him not to begin anything about this. "I know you will," he said. "I just mean the timing." She made a note in the ledger and closed it. "The third field will be wheat again," she said. "All of it. The market is right, and the soil in the north section is going to respond well if we spend the winter on it." "Agreed," he said, and she nodded, and they spent the next hour planning the north section over the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them and the night outside and the baby not yet arrived, and the orchard trees small and bare along the western fence, and everything in its right and proper season. The winter of 1875 and into early 1876 was a time of warmth inside the house, even while the plains were cold. Eleanor's pregnancy was not an easy one. She was tired in ways she had not expected, and she was too honest to pretend otherwise, which meant occasionally accepting help with things she would usually have insisted on doing herself. She found this difficult in the specific way that self-sufficient people find accepting help difficult, which is to say, she found it personally offensive at a level she recognized as unreasonable, but felt nonetheless. Eli handled this with patience and without making her feel managed about it, which she appreciated more than she could easily express. Clara had taken on the daily egg collection and the lighter kitchen tasks with a quiet competence that made both Eleanor and Eli look at her sometimes with a startled recognition of what she was becoming. This serious, capable, deeply curious child who carried her father's specific quality of attentiveness to the world and her mother's specific quality of stubborn, excellent judgment, and who was going to be, when she was grown, formidable in the most admirable way. He told his mother in a letter that a baby was coming, and her reply this time was faster, almost as if she had been waiting for exactly this news. She was coming to Kansas, she wrote, in the spring to help with the baby and to meet this remarkable family her son had acquired. She had a neighbor who would look after her farm for a month. She had not traveled since his father died, and she had decided that this was the occasion to travel again. "Your mother is coming," Eleanor said, reading the letter. "She is not someone who asks permission," he said. "She has always been more of an announcer of decisions." Eleanor looked up from the letter with an expression of recognition. "She sounds like someone I could get along with very well." "That is what I am afraid of," he said, and she laughed. The baby came in the last week of March, 1876, with a March wind outside and Clara stationed in the kitchen with strict instructions to remain there, and Hattie Bloom serving as midwife with the efficiency of a woman who had brought 43 babies into Sumner County and found all of them worthwhile. Eli waited on the porch through most of it, because that was where he had been directed to wait, and the cold night air was something to do with his hands and his worry. And when he heard the first cry come through the window, he went very still and looked at the stars above the Kansas dark and felt something he did not have full language for, something like gratitude so complete it became almost physical. It was a boy. He was healthy and loud about it, and he had Eleanor's dark hair and Eli's jaw, according to Hattie Bloom, who had opinions about these resemblances. Eleanor held him in the lamplight with an expression that Eli, standing in the doorway of the room, would remember for the rest of his life, the specific expression of a woman who has already known profound love and loss, and who is now holding new life, and can feel both things simultaneously. The grief and the joy not canceling each other, but existing together with a fullness that is only possible in people who have lived completely. "Come in," she said, when she saw him in the doorway. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and then at his wife. And he was not a man who cried easily, but his eyes were bright. "Hello," he said softly to the small face which regarded him with the profound indifference of the newly arrived. "He needs a name," Eleanor said. "What do you think?" he said. "Thomas was my first thought," she said, and she watched his face. "If you are all right with that." "I am more than all right with that," he said, and meant it fully. "Thomas Henry Calloway," she said, trying it. Thomas for her first husband, who deserved to be remembered. Henry for Eli's father, who also deserved to be remembered. Calloway because this child was new life built on everything that had come before. "Thomas Henry Calloway," Eli said. "That is a very good name for someone to grow into." Clara was allowed in after a suitable interval, and she stood at the bedside and looked at her brother with the evaluating focus she brought to everything new. "He is very small," she said. "Babies generally are," Eleanor said. "When will he be able to play checkers?" Clara asked. "Several years from now," Eli said. Clara sighed. "That is a long time to wait," she said, but she reached out and very carefully touched Thomas Henry's hand with one finger, and the baby's fingers curled around hers with the reflex of the newborn, and Clara's face changed into something open and young and thoroughly undone, and she said, barely above a whisper, "Oh." "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "Oh." Eli's mother, Margaret Calloway, arrived by train to Caldwell 3 weeks after Thomas Henry's birth, which was reasonably good timing for someone traveling from Missouri in the spring of 1876. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and the same dark eyes as her son, and she walked off the train platform at Caldwell and looked at the Kansas sky and said, "Well, this is a great deal of sky." "Yes," Eli said. "It is." "Good," she said, as if sky were something she approved of having in quantity. She met Eleanor in the kitchen of the homestead, where Eleanor was up and moving despite being 3 weeks postpartum, because Eleanor was constitutionally incapable of not being useful, and Margaret Calloway assessed her daughter-in-law with a swift and comprehensive gaze and said, "You must be Eleanor. My son's letters about you were considerably more restrained than the subject warrants." Eleanor looked at Eli over Margaret's head, and he shrugged with an expression that was equal parts apology and acknowledgement that he had entirely expected this. "I am glad he wrote," Eleanor said. "Sit down, I will make coffee." "You will sit down," Margaret said, "and I will make coffee because you had a baby 3 weeks ago, and regardless of how capable you are, which I can see you are very, sitting down is the appropriate activity." There was a beat of silence in which Eleanor clearly weighed the options. "The coffee is in the tin above the stove," Eleanor said, sitting down. Margaret made the coffee and then held Thomas Henry, who was awake and considering the ceiling, and she looked at him with the specific tenderness of grandmothers who have earned it, and she said quietly to the baby, "You have been given a very good start, young man. Do not waste it." She stayed for 5 weeks instead of the planned 1 month, and in that time she and Eleanor became exactly what Eli had both predicted and been amused to fear, a formidable combination. 2 intelligent, practical women who operated at a similar frequency, who could plan and execute and disagree, and come to conclusions with an efficiency that made the men around them seem somewhat deliberate by comparison. She helped Eleanor with the baby, and she helped plan the kitchen garden expansion, and she told stories about Eli's childhood that he would have preferred remain in Missouri, and she taught Clara 3 different variants of checkers, which Clara received like a gift from above. When she left at the end of April, she hugged Eleanor on the platform and said, "You are everything he said. You are more than everything he said." And Eleanor, who did not cry easily, blinked quickly and said, "Come back in the fall. The orchard trees will be bigger." "I will come back," Margaret said, and she did every year after that. The spring of 1876 was full. The third field went in as planned, all winter wheat, with the north section prepared over the winter as Eleanor had designed it, and it came up well in the April warmth. The orchard trees were in their second year and showing the upward reach of established growth. The kitchen garden was the largest it had been, filling the space alongside the house with an organized abundance that in June and July would provide more than the family could eat fresh and send Eleanor to the task of preserving and putting up stores for winter, which she found satisfying in the direct way of seeing a season's work become the next season's sustenance. Eli had begun doing occasional work for neighboring homesteaders' carpentry, fence repair, skilled agricultural advising when someone had a problem with a field or a drainage issue, and the reputation he had built over the winter of 1874 and into 1875 had become something real and recognized. People came to him with questions about difficult land, and he answered them as honestly as he could, drawing on what Eleanor had taught him, and what his Missouri childhood had given him, and what 2 years of daily attention to the Devil's Stretch had added to both. He refused to be called anything like an expert, which was itself a form of expertise that people recognized. Clara, in the fall of 1876, started a new school year at 8 years old, and announced at dinner one evening that her teacher had told her she was the best reader in the school, and possibly the best reader the teacher had encountered in 15 years of teaching. She reported this without excessive pride in the way she reported facts she had confirmed and found notable, and Eleanor said, "Your father would be so pleased." And Clara was quiet for a moment and then said, "I know, I read to him sometimes in my head. Is that strange?" "No," Eleanor said, "that is not strange at all." Thomas Henry, by the fall of 1876, was 6 months old and had developed into a person with strong opinions about things, expressed with the volume and persistence that were apparently characteristic of the Calloway line, according to Margaret's letters. He had his mother's thoughtful eyes, and what Eli privately thought was her expression when she was considering something complex, a slight narrowing, a tilt of the head. He was learning to sit up, and had accomplished this with the determined effort of a baby who takes setbacks as information rather than conclusions, which Eleanor found familiar and Eli found wonderful. The 1876 harvest was the best they had had. The winter wheat from the expanded field sold at a price that reflected the growing regional demand, and when Eleanor closed the ledger in October, she did not just say they were not in debt. She said they had a surplus, and named the figure, and Eli looked at it, and then at the woman across the table from him who had driven a shovel into cracked white earth 2.5 years ago while the whole county watched with polite skepticism, and he said, "Eleanor Marsh." "Eleanor Calloway," she said with a small, precise smile. "Eleanor Calloway," he said. "What do you want to do with it?" She had thought about this, he could tell. She had the look of someone presenting a considered plan rather than generating ideas in the moment. "I want to build a proper house," she said. "Not a sod house with wood elements. A proper wood house, with a real floor throughout and a real roof and a room for Thomas and a room for Clara that is more than adequate and a room for us and a kitchen that is twice the size of this one." She had said us with the ease of someone for whom the word had become entirely natural, and he felt the quiet, complete pleasure of that ease. "A proper house on the Devil's Stretch," he said. "People need to stop calling it that," she said. "It is not the Devil's Stretch anymore. What is it?" She thought for a moment. "The Calloway place," she said simply. He reached across the table and took her hand. "The Calloway place," he said. They built the house the following spring, with the help of neighbors and the skills Eli had accumulated, and a careful plan Eleanor drew on paper over the winter. And by the summer of 1877, it stood solid and real on the land that nobody had wanted, with a proper porch across the front and windows with glass in them, and a kitchen that was exactly twice the size of the old one. Clara had a room with a window that faced east, where the morning light came first, which she had specifically requested because it was the direction of the best bird activity in the mornings. Thomas Henry had a room with a window that faced the field, which nobody had specifically planned but which seemed exactly right. The old house they kept for storage and eventually converted over the following years into a proper workshop and supply room. The orchard trees bore their first small fruit in the late summer of 1878, just as Eleanor had predicted they might. She picked the first apple from the first tree on a September morning and bit into it there in the orchard, and it was small and slightly tart and entirely real, and she stood in the orchard with apple juice on her chin and 3 years of patience behind her and looked at her husband, who had come out from the field to see. "Well," he said, "3 more years of work," she said, chewing, "and they will be magnificent." "Worth the wait," he said. She held the apple out to him. He took it and bit into it. It was, in the specific way of things that have been grown slowly and deliberately, and with care, exactly as good as it should be. They stood in the orchard together in the September morning, and from inside the house came the sound of Thomas Henry, who was 2.5 and had recently discovered the acoustic properties of the kitchen floor, and from the eastern field came the sound of Clara, who was 10 and who had been given the task of checking the wheat crop that morning, and was evidently reporting her findings to the birds, because her voice floated on the prairie wind in the animated cadences of detailed explanation. Aldous Crane had left Caldwell in 1876, his buyer for the Devil's Stretch land having given up and moved on, and a new, less strategically grasping banker had taken his position. The new man, a Mr. Everett, had introduced himself to Eleanor within his first month, and told her that the Calloway homestead was, in his assessment, one of the most successfully developed properties in the county, and that if she ever needed lending for agricultural expansion, he would be delighted to facilitate it on favorable terms. She had thanked him and said she would keep it in mind. She had also, quietly, paid attention to the 3 neighboring homesteaders who were struggling in the particular ways she recognized, and had made herself available to them in the way that Hattie Bloom had once made herself available to her, not with pity and preserved peaches, but with practical knowledge and honest help, and the specific generosity of someone who has come through difficulty and knows what difficulty looks like from the outside. She helped a young widow named Ruth Dalton amend her soil in the fall of 1876, giving her time and attention, and the knowledge she had developed about the clay ground in the area, and Ruth's crop the following year was substantially better, and Ruth came to Eleanor afterward with tears in her eyes that Eleanor met with a practicality and warmth that left Ruth feeling capable rather than indebted, which was precisely the intention. In the spring of 1878, Eleanor was expecting again, and this time she told Eli before she was even entirely certain, because she had learned over the course of their marriage that uncertainty was not a thing she needed to manage alone. "I think," she said on a March morning, "that there will be another Calloway by October." He looked at her across the kitchen, and his face did the same thing it had done before, the surprise and then the warmth, and he said, "Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling very well," she said. "Better than last time. I think this one is more cooperative." She was right. The second pregnancy was easier, and in October a baby girl arrived, healthy and immediately opinionated about being in the world, which she expressed with a vigor that woke Clara down the hall and brought her to the doorway, where she stood blinking and then said, "She is much louder than Thomas was." "Yes," Eleanor said, exhausted and radiant. "What is her name?" Clara asked. Eleanor and Eli looked at each other. They had talked about it. "Margaret Louise Calloway," Eleanor said. Margaret for Eli's mother, who would receive this news by letter and respond with a delight that was probably audible all the way from Missouri. Louise for Eleanor's mother, who had died years ago and who deserved to be carried forward. "Margaret," Clara repeated. "I will call her Maggie." "We will see," Eleanor said, meaning yes, Maggie she was. She came into the household like a weather event, constant motion, constant noise, constant intensity, and Thomas Henry, who was 2.5, regarded his sister with the baffled interest of a person confronting something they did not entirely understand, but intended to monitor closely. Clara took to her with the authority of someone who had been waiting for a project worthy of her organizational capabilities. Eli held Maggie in the evenings in the rocking chair he had made the previous winter, rocking her while Eleanor rested, and the baby looked up at him with the specific dark-eyed focus of a person still figuring out the terms of existence. And he said to her, quietly, the things that a man says to a child when there is no one else listening, that the world she had arrived in was imperfect and beautiful, that the land she had been born on was hard and good and hard-won, that she had a mother who was the most determined person on the Kansas prairie and a father who had ridden 400 miles of trail and ended up exactly where he was supposed to be. The land continued to grow. By 1880, the Calloway homestead was a recognized and respected property in Sumner County, not because it had become grand, it had not, but because it had become undeniably, visibly real. The 3 fields were all under cultivation, rotated carefully according to a system Eleanor had developed over the years, taking information from the agricultural college pamphlets and adapting it to the specific knowledge she had accumulated about this particular soil. The orchard was bearing properly, and the apple harvest of 1880 gave them enough to sell a portion to the general store, where Gerald Potts, older now and slower but still presiding, stocked them with the particular pleasure of a man who had been present at the beginning of a long story and was grateful to see its current chapter. Clara was 12 and had been declared by her teacher, a different teacher now, one who had come west from Chicago and found the prairie children unexpectedly formidable, to be beyond the curriculum available to her in Caldwell's schoolhouse. Eleanor and Eli discussed this at the kitchen table over several evenings with the seriousness it deserved. Eleanor had not had the opportunity for more education than the frontier school offered, and she felt the limitation of that sometimes, particularly when she read the agricultural pamphlets and encountered terms she had to puzzle out. She was not going to let Clara hit the same wall. They wrote to the school at Topeka, and through a combination of Clara's academic record, Eleanor's detailed letter about her daughter's circumstances and abilities, and Eli's reputation in the county, arrangements were made for Clara to attend the school there starting in the fall of 1881, boarding with a reliable family Eli had found through his connections in the cattle trade, people who had settled in Topeka after years on the trail, and whose daughter was about Clara's age. I do not want to go, Clara said, when the decision was final, and it was the most vulnerable Eli had ever seen her, because Clara Marsh Calloway did not often show the soft edges of herself. I know, Eleanor said. It is far, Clara said. It is far, Eleanor agreed. But you are going to come back every Christmas and every summer, and you are going to learn things that we cannot teach you here, and you are going to do something with what you learn that is worth the distance. Clara was quiet for a moment. What if I am lonely? You will be lonely sometimes, Eleanor said honestly. That is part of learning who you are away from the people who already know you. Clara looked at Eli. He said, you wrote in that bird book that the red-tailed hawk migrates hundreds of miles and comes back to the same territory every spring. It comes back because it knows where home is. She looked at him for a long moment. That is a very good use of the bird book, she said, which from Clara was high praise. She went to Topeka in September of 1881, 13 years old, with her bird book and her natural history encyclopedia and her checkers set, and her mother's clear eyes and her father Thomas's gentle attention to the world. And within a month, she was writing letters home that were by turns homesick and excited, and full of detail about everything she was learning, which was the right proportion for someone being properly educated. Thomas Henry, at 6, immediately assumed the role of oldest present child, with a thoroughness that gave both his parents complicated amusement. He was a serious boy who had his mother's relationship with the land. He walked the fields with Eleanor in the morning sometimes, asking questions about what he saw, and his questions were specific and observant in the way that told you he was already building a picture. He had also, to Eli's private delight, begun to show an aptitude for the mechanical problem-solving that went with farm maintenance, and could at 6 years old look at a fence post that needed resetting and have a correct opinion about the best way to do it. Maggie, at 3, was an entirely different character, quick and loud and enormously sociable, the first of them to learn everyone's name in the county, arriving at any gathering and immediately conducting herself as if she had organized the whole thing. She had Eleanor's stubbornness, and Eli's easy laughter, and some quality that was entirely her own, a kind of joyful insistence on the world's potential that was the specific gift of people born into stability that was hard-won by those before them. The summer of 1882 was particularly beautiful on the Kansas plains, one of those seasons that felt like the land was showing off good rainfall at the right intervals, warm days with enough wind to keep the worst of the heat manageable, a harvest that shaped up in late August as the best the Calloway homestead had seen. Eleanor walked the fields in August with Thomas Henry beside her, doing the specific walk she did every year before harvest, moving between the rows and looking at the grain, reading the field the way her father had taught her in Ohio, and the way she had learned herself in the years of trial and attention on this land. "It is going to be good," Thomas Henry said, looking at the wheat. "Yes," Eleanor said, "it is. The north section the best," he said. She looked at him, and there was something in his assessment that was not just a boy repeating what he had heard, but someone who had been paying his own attention. "Yes," she said, "the north section the best." They walked on. The sun was high and the wheat was gold-green, and the orchard along the western fence had the dark, full-leafed look of established trees in their prime. 8 years, Eleanor thought. 8 years since she had driven the shovel into the white cracked earth, and everyone in Caldwell had been politely certain she was going to fail. 8 years since a trail-dusted cowboy had crossed the street to help her pick up spilled grain. She felt Eli before she heard him, the particular quality of him becoming visible at the edge of the north field, walking toward her from the house, where he had been doing repair work on the hay barn roof. He raised a hand when he saw her, and Thomas Henry ran toward him with the full-body enthusiasm of a 6-year-old with news to deliver, and she watched her son reach her husband and begin telling him about the north section, gesticulating at the field, and watched Eli crouch down to Thomas Henry's eye level and listen to him the way he listened to everything that mattered completely, without distraction, with the full attention of someone who understood that the things being said were important precisely because the person saying them found them important. She walked toward them across the field that she had grown from nothing, on the land that nobody had wanted, and the late summer sky was enormous above the Kansas prairie, and the grain moved in the wind, and the orchard trees stood in their maturity along the fence, and the house her husband had helped her build was solid on the rise behind them, and she thought about the morning she had told Clara that bad land was rarely hopeless land, that it just needed someone willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of bringing it back. She had been talking about the soil then. She had not known she was also talking about herself. Eli looked up and saw her coming, and he smiled, the particular smile he kept for her, the one that had taken months to emerge and that she had never taken for granted since the first time she saw it. And she felt the warmth of it the same way she had felt it the first time, as something that reached all the way in. She reached them, and Thomas Henry immediately began telling her what he had just told Eli about the north section, apparently feeling that important agricultural information should be shared with all available adults, and Eli caught her hand as she arrived and held it, and the three of them stood in the field in the August light. Clara would come home from Topeka in December, and Margaret Calloway would come from Missouri in the fall, and the harvest would be brought in and sold, and the ledger would record another year of the Calloway place on the land that nobody had wanted. The orchard would be pressed for cider, and the winter wheat would be planted, and the fence line would be checked, and the soil would be turned, and the whole long, beautiful, ordinary work of it would go on. There would be harder years and easier years and seasons that tested the limits of what the land and the people on it could sustain. There would be a drought in 1886 that took one of the apple trees and thinned the wheat crop to a margin that required careful management, and a visit from the Topeka bank that Eleanor handled with the same immovable calm she had brought to Aldous Crane a decade before. There would be a season when Thomas Henry was sick with a fever that kept them both awake for 10 days, and the specific terror of that would be something neither of them fully recovered from, and the specific relief of him recovering would be one of the purest moments of Eli's life. There would be the year Clara came back from Topeka with a letter of acceptance to teach at the school in Wichita, and sat at the kitchen table and wept from the happiness of it, while Eleanor held her and Eli watched from the doorway, and felt the full complicated pride of a man watching someone become what they were always meant to be. There would be the year Maggie at 14 decided she wanted to learn everything there was to know about the medicinal properties of prairie plants, which led to a correspondence with a botanist in Kansas City, and eventually, years later, to a Maggie Calloway who was known throughout western Kansas as someone you went to when the regular remedies were not working. There would be the year Thomas Henry at 20 was given the management of the North Field as his own responsibility, and handled it with a quiet competence that made Eleanor remember the boy who at 6 had known, without being told, that the North section was the best. But all of that was ahead of them in the August of 1882, in the field, with the wind in the wheat and the sky enormous above the prairie. For now, there was only this: a woman who had driven her shovel into cracked white earth and refused to let the ground be what everyone said it was. A man who had ridden 400 miles of trail and ended up, by the specific grace of a split-grain bag and a clear pair of eyes, exactly where he was supposed to be. A boy with good opinions about fence posts and the North section. And somewhere inside the house, a girl who believed the world was full of potential and was going to be correct about that for the rest of her long and useful life. The Calloway place stood on what had been the worst piece of farmable land in Sumner County. The sorghum was long since replaced by winter wheat in the main fields, and the orchard was mature and magnificent along the western fence, and the kitchen garden was a thing of reliable abundance, and the fields that Eleanor had laid out in careful rows from the beginning were green and gold and real. The land that nobody had wanted had become something that no one would give up now for anything. And the two people who had made it so stood in it together in the summer light, holding hands in the field they had built from impossible ground, and everything between them was full and close and certain, the way only things that have been genuinely worked for can be, not the easy certainty of things that were never questioned, but the deep, unshakable certainty of things that have been tested by hard seasons and held. The wind moved through the wheat. The hawks circled above the orchard. The sky went on and on in every direction, the way the Kansas sky did, as if it had decided that this particular piece of earth deserved the very best of everything the horizon had to offer. It did.